The Liberal Democrat leadership contest is taking place right now, overshadowed by the global pandemic. But will it herald another Liberal revival or the demise of the party? I asked former leader Sir Vince Cable and former MP Lembit Opik, who will inherit the Liberal crown? Join us in the Alex Salmond Show, on air and online.
Welcome to the Alex Salmond Show, where during this global pandemic, a leadership election is quietly going on behind me here at Westminster. Originally, no less than 5 out of the 11 Liberal Democrat MPs fancied a turn at being leader, but one by one the field was thinned out until only 2 remain: acting leader and favourite Ed Davey and the Oxford MP Leila Moran. Today we ask former leader Sir Vince Cable to assess the strengths and weaknesses of the challengers for the crown.
Well, I think they're both strong and, will be well served whichever of them wins. I mean, Ed Davey obviously has the experience, former member of the cabinet, looked after environment, heavily into climate change negotiations, things of that kind. Leila is different. She came in after the coalition, a completely new generation, will approach things in a fresh and a different way.
And then former Liberal Democrat presidential candidate Lembit Opik picks a winner.
If Ed Davey wins, it'll be more of the same. He looks like the favourite because he's had a lot more coverage because he's been the acting leader. But in actual fact, Leila Moran should win because she's really the only person, I have to say, who's got the chance of recovering the party. If you really pin me down, my money's on Leila Moran because I think others feel the same way.
All that to come, but first your tweets, emails and messages on last week's show on the arts in lockdown, which featured Elaine C. Smith and Gareth Wardell. First, Joe says, I really loved this week's show about the theatre and laughed out loud at Elaine C. Smith's funny story about the vehicle with their 784 logo. Thanks to the whole team, keep up the good work. Well, thank you, Joe, and keep watching. Richard says, just watched your interview with Alex Salmond. He's speaking about Gareth Wardell's interview. Great to hear about your work championing the arts in Scotland and establishing a national youth theatre. Agree with your criticism of Edinburgh Festival, now dominated by comedy and commercial interests. It urgently needs an overhaul. Fraser says, it's quite a relief this Edinburgh Festival is not on. It's so peaceful here. It is exhausting hearing these thespians doing Edinburgh. Nelson says, a fine example in furthering interest and encouragement in this field. Much attention has always been given to the tourism industry. There is, of course, the real task ahead in the rebuilding of industrial workplaces that once were. Bridie says, I took Spanish friends last year. It was dreadful. We couldn't walk, couldn't find a place to eat or sit. They had a very bad impression of Edinburgh. Dave says, I've been a fan of the Edinburgh Festival and have introduced many of my friends and family to it. Pity it's not on. Raymond says, was there last year for the festivals. Loved it. One of my best vacations ever. And finally, I Aberdeen say, great to see the Edinburgh Festivals continuing as an online event. But now to the Liberal Democrats, where Alex is joined by the former party leader, Sir Vince Cable.
Now, to assess this 2-horse race for the Liberal Democrat leadership, who better than former party leader Sir Vince Cable, who joins me from his home in Twickenham. Vince, welcome to the Alex Salmond Show.
Oh, it's great to be with you, Alex.
Now, Sir Vince, the Leila Moran, Ed Davey, both served under you when you were Liberal Democrat leader. You know them particularly well. What would you say the contrasting styles and the strengths and weaknesses of both candidates are?
Well, I think they're both strong and, will be well served whichever of them wins. I mean, Ed Davey obviously has the experience, former member of the cabinet, looked after environment, heavily into climate change negotiations, things of that kind. Knows a lot of economics, good economic background. Leila is different. She came in after the coalition, a completely new generation, very fresh approach, an interesting cosmopolitan background. Her mother was Palestinian. She's, absorbed, quite a lot of that, outward-looking international way of looking at the world, and she's burned up in the last 3 years on education. She's very strong on education issues at all levels and will approach things in a fresh and a different way.
Now, have you got a feeling for who might be ahead in the race thus far? And are you backing any particular candidate?
No, I haven't committed myself either way. I don't think as a former leader it's helpful, but I'd be happy with either of them. I would guess Ed Davey has some inbuilt advantages because he's been around a while. Everybody knows him in the party. Layla's trying to make herself known, but yeah, they're both in with a sporting chance, and it is, of course, a very unorthodox system of leadership hustings entirely done remotely. So we don't know what will happen.
It's been quite difficult to generate a huge amount of publicity for the leadership contest outside the party ranks itself. Do you think that that's a feature of lockdown and the global pandemic, or is it more a commentary on the party only having 11 MPs?
Well, it's a bit of both. But the biggest challenge, and it was the same challenge I had, but it's now worse, is that the party's been through three really bad elections, 15, 17, and last year. It's been knocked back. And I think it was particularly hard last time because we built up, certainly in the latter stages when I was leader, to a good position, about 20% in the polls. We were doing well in local government, in the Euro elections, and we slumped again. And picking up people's morale in those circumstances is really very difficult. So I don't envy the new leader. It's a major task. And of course, you have this additional problem that if you have a small number of MPs, you get very little attention in Parliament. It's difficult to be called. We're very much the fourth party after your party in parliamentary terms. It's also difficult to get into the media. So it's going to be a very difficult job. I found it hard enough.
Well, very modestly, Sir Vince, you passed over the great electoral success that you had as leader only a year ago in the European elections, where you were 20% of the vote, came second in the polls. Labour and Tories were absolutely nowhere. Does any thought if you regret not staying on and taking advantage of that platform and leading the party into the last general election?
Well, I think we all have mixed feelings about these things. I'd made a conscious decision. I wanted to pass on to the next generation and get on with my life and do other things, which is what I'm doing now. But I sometimes think that, if I'd been there, I wouldn't have done this, I wouldn't have done that. But I think whoever had been leader, we were going to have problems in that December election. Yeah, actually, one of the factors which was very powerful in the kind of Tory leading areas in England, Scotland, as you know, different politics, but was the massive deterrent effect of Mr. Corbyn. I got door after door, people saying, we'd love to vote for you, we agree with you on Europe, we quite like your party, but we're not going to risk having that lot running the country. And that, unfortunately, really did for us quite a lot of damage. And whoever had been leader would have had to contend with that.
Well, was there a moment last year in the aftermath of Boris Johnson's defeat in the Supreme Court when his policy on proroguing Parliament was declared unlawful, where his government was rocking? Was there any moment there where an anti-Brexit coalition could have been brought together with a bit of flexibility and changed the course of history, or do you think that it was an illusion that could ever have happened?
Well, there was a kind of anti-Brexit coalition. We worked together. I worked together very well with Ian Blackford and the Welsh Nationalists, the Greens and others, and Tory defectors. We had a very good operation, but there wasn't enough momentum actually behind the idea of a referendum on the outcome of the negotiations. That was the critical thing. And that was in large part because there was a substantial body of Labour MPs, maybe 50. Jeremy Corbyn himself was ambiguous. And we just didn't have enough to get that over the line, unfortunately. That was the critical thing.
And was there never a moment where a compromise candidate as an interim Prime Minister, maybe a Ken Clarke figure could have been found, or was that something ruled out by the Labour Party while the Liberal Democrats were ruling out Jeremy Corbyn? Was there nothing could have been done to given the proximity of Brexit, to tip Johnson out of Downing Street while you had the chance?
I think that was the optimal outcome. I certainly favoured it and I argued for it, and a lot of us did. Somebody like Ken Clarke, they the welders, but he was a superb character who wasn't a party leader, could have commanded cross-party support. That was indeed the solution. I think there was a genuine problem with the Labour Party, certainly in terms of their public position. I gathered that privately they might have settled for that. Certainly my party took up quite a strident position of not having the Labour leader. I think if we could have got that neutral third party figurehead leader, we might have made some headway. And I think historians will focus on that particular point. That was a point at which the campaign started to ebb away.
And there was a great deal of enthusiasm in the run-up to the general election from the Liberal Democrats and indeed the SNP to actually have an election. But the end game is that Johnson's in Downing Street with a 80-seat majority and can basically do what he likes. Now, it's easy with hindsight, of course, but with that hindsight, that probably wasn't the wisest election to be forced ever.
It wasn't. I mean, I think I could understand why your party pushed for an election. I mean, they were, doing very well in the polls in Scotland. I think in our case, it probably was a mistake. We could have hung back and tried to modify the legislation on the treaty as it went through Parliament. I think if we made one big mistake, it was calling for revoke. Now, we all agreed that in the final analysis, revocation was the thing to do. But as a campaigning issue, it wasn't right. We'd campaigned for 2 years on getting the referendum. We should have stuck with that. I think a lot of people were rather put off with the peremptory idea of just cancelling the last referendum. I think that was one of the mistakes that some of our campaigners made.
And how should the party approach Brexit now that it has happened legally and is about to happen economically? I mean, what's the party's attitude and indeed the two candidates for leadership? How should they deal with the Brexit issue now?
Well, I think, shouting about it probably isn't helpful. Nobody's listening certainly on the other side. People have made up their minds. The thing has gone through. It's awfully easy to sound, sour grapes, backward looking. I think what I would like to see the leaders do is to sketch out a kind of a future which is European, but isn't just harking back to the own arrangements. I mean, I think we will see in the next 5 to 10 years an approach within Europe which allows certain countries to go at a different speed. I know this has often been discussed. Macron has advocated it. Countries that are not part of the monetary union and have no intention of being, but nonetheless wish to play an important role in Europe and probably are able to get back to a kind of Norwegian type close trade integration. I mean, I think that's the thing which pro-Europeans, and I think your party as well, would probably be quite comfortable with that kind of position.
Stay with us after the break for more from Vince Cable as he and Alex discuss the Liberal Democrats' contest for a new leader. We'll see you then. Welcome back as Alex talks to former Liberal Democrat Party leader Sir Vince Cable.
Sir Vince Cable, is the strategic difficulty that the Liberal Democrats have that the Keir Starmer is peddling the Labour Party at a fair rate of knots back to the centre ground of politics, which decreases the openings that the Liberal Democrats would have if the Labour Party were positioned much further to the left? Is that a key strategic difficulty, and how should either of the leadership candidates seek to tackle that?
No, I see it as an opportunity rather than as a difficulty. As I explained earlier, I think one of the reasons a lot of our putative supporters backed off was because of fear of a hard left Labour government. And I think if you have a Labour leadership which is electable, and Keir Starmer, I think, certainly comes into that category. There are parts of the country, parts of England, and odd seats in Scotland where people will vote for the Lib Dems and want to, and where Labour are not serious competitors. I'm thinking of my own seat, where there's now a big Lib Dem majority, but there are a lot of other places around in the south of England, the Guildfords, the Winchesters, which didn't go last time, which would go next time, some of the suburbs of Manchester, Harrogate in Yorkshire, places like that. Maybe there are 30 plus seats which we could win in a way that we're complementary to the Labour Party rather than competitive with it. And if that happens, you've got serious numbers for an alternative government. I was there in 1997. I mean, that's how many of us got into Parliament in the first place with the Blair Revolution. It was a complementarity with the Labour Party rather than competition.
And finally, Sir Vince Cable, on that message of the future, can you identify for us some of the new stars in the Liberal Democrat firmament who'll take the message forward? And what would you say to them, given your experience in politics? What would be your message to the rising stars of liberal democracy?
Well, I think, you have to be resilient. And I think people often say that in politics you need, real talent and wit and intelligence. And of course, those things matter. But I think the quality more than anything that you require is stamina, ability to take punishment and to keep going and to come back. That, so in terms of my own party, we've got some very, very good people. Munira Wilson, who first ethnic minority candidate who's come up through a general election. Daisy Cooper in St Albans. I mean, they're very, very capable people, and I think we'll be in good hands.
So Vince Cable, former leader of the Liberal Democrats, demonstrating there's life after politics. Thank you very much for joining us on the Alex Salmond Show.
Thank you.
So Sir Vince Cable, while praising both leadership candidates, gives a slight edge to Ed Davey in the race for the Liberal crown. For a rather different view, Alex turned to former Lib Dem MP and political commentator Lembit Opik.
So who's going to win this Liberal Democrat race? I turn to former Liberal Democrat MP Lembit Opik. Lembit, who's going to win, Layla Moran or Ed Davey?
It's a dead heat, but I can give you more than just a careful, cautiously worded response. If Ed Davey wins, it'll be more of the same. He looks like the favourite because he's had a lot more coverage because he's been the acting leader. But in actual fact, Leila Moran should win because she's really the only person, I have to say, who's got the chance of recovering the party. If you really pin me down, my money's on Leila Moran because I think others feel the same way.
So you're backing the outsider according to the betting. What is this special factor you think Leila Moran offers the Liberal Democrats?
Change. Let's remember that Ed Davey carries a huge amount of baggage. I used to share an office with him, in fact, and he was right down the line with the Nick Clegg cabal. We know the Nick Clegg cabal, and Nick Clegg particularly destroyed the party. I wrote a book about this, and sadly for the Lib Dems, I was proved right in just about every prediction. The other thing about Ed Davey is he's mired by the fact that he voted for tuition fees for students, direct break of a core promise in the 2010 general election, and that really did fall the student vote for the Lib Dems. He can't get away from that fact. By contrast, Leila Moran wasn't there. She isn't mired by that problem, and also she's quite clearly a radical left-leaning libertarian. She's quite characterful as well. Now, I don't think that Ed Davey can offer anything new. I don't dislike him. He's a decent man, but I don't think he can offer anything new, whereas Leila Moran might be the shot in the arm that Lib Dems need for a long and slow recovery.
Well, let me put the contrary view. I mean, with only 11 members of Parliament, 5 in the Scottish Parliament, 1 in the Welsh Parliament, don't the Liberal Democrats actually need somebody with governmental experience to give the party some weight that it doesn't have in terms of numbers?
They don't need someone with governmental experience. That's irrelevant. If anything, it's a negative because the governmental experience that Davey carries with him is the baggage of a coalition which destroyed the Liberal Democrats under Nick Clegg. How does he explain why he voted so consistently with the Conservatives when we know that's a big minus, a big turnoff for many of the traditional Liberal Democrat voters who deserted the party when they felt deserted by Nick Clegg's part of the Conservative coalition? By contrast, Leila Moran is not tarnished by that brush. Let's remember that Tim Farron, who was briefly leader, did well specifically because he was an outsider during the coalition with the Conservatives. So I don't think there's any benefit, or to be absolutely pedantic about this, any experience and benefit that Ed Davey carries with him from government is more than outweighed by the negatives for exactly the same reason.
Well, I've got to press you on this, Lembit Opik. Leila Moran started as favourite, but Ed Davey has now replaced her in at least the bookmaker odds as the odds-on favourite. So he must be doing something right in this campaign, and Leila Moran must be doing something wrong. Doesn't that follow?
I don't think Leila Moran's doing anything wrong, but the bias, as I see it, in this election is the fact that Ed Davey is repeatedly touted as the acting leader, the leader in waiting. Now, profile, as I know from my benefit and to my cost, is everything in terms of what the bookies think. And it probably does help Ed Davey with a proportion of the Liberal Democrat electorate. But remember, this is a fairly small and very clearly defined group who will also say, well, Ed Davey was in government and that was catastrophic for us. To that extent, Leila Moran could win specifically because she is the outsider. You're right about the odds. I'm not sure that I'm right about Leila Moran winning, but I am sure that if Ed Davey wins, there won't be a huge lift for the party, and they'll be carrying all of that package from the coalition, which they've really got to cut loose from. Ed Davey can't do that. Leila Moran can.
But isn't the big strategic difficulty for the Liberal Democrats is that Sir Keir Starmer is obviously leading Labour back to the centre ground. He's disposing of the Corbynite baggage at a fairly rapid rate of knots. Doesn't that crowd out the Liberal Democrats' room in the political spectrum? Isn't that a problem for both of these candidates?
Let's turn to the question of spin, and history records that I have been tremendously good and tremendously bad at that in my own career, so maybe I am qualified to comment. The issue here is that Ed Davey doesn't create a radical position on any score. There isn't anything new about what Ed Davey can say. Once again, I stress I don't dislike him, but I just don't see what he brings to the party, literally, that the party hasn't already got and hasn't already suffered when it came to the coalition. Now look at Leila Moran. She's a libertarian. She's made some pretty radical comments even about her sexuality. All of that is quite interesting to the Lib Dems. But central to all of this is Leila Moran thinks for herself. She has been willing to take some fairly unorthodox positions in this election. Now that's exciting. I would summarize it like this. Ed Davey can't recover the party's fortunes anytime soon, probably not even in a 10-year leadership. Leila Moran might. It's not guaranteed, but she might. And if there's a definite no and a possible yes, I think the party should go for the possible yes.
And finally, Lembit Opik, isn't there a kind of hopeful scenario for the Liberal Democrats that a Johnson government becomes deeply unpopular? There's a big anti-Tory swing, and just like as in 1997, Liberal Democrats are floated in constituencies where there's no credible challenge from the Labour Party. I mean, couldn't you get a number of MPs back on Labour's coattails? And isn't that a reasonable chance of happening in 5 years' time, when nobody will remember the evils of the coalition government between the Tories and the Liberal Democrats?
The Lib Dems' biggest hope is that forces outside their control restore the party's fortunes. As you've described, the best thing that can happen to the Lib Dems is the worst thing that can happen to the country, a catastrophic Conservative Boris Johnson administration. It's sad to hope for failure to get success for a party, but we're talking about facts here rather than hopes. Now, when it comes to the question of who would benefit most for the party in that circumstance, it's still Leila Moran, because there will be some people who remember that Ed Davey is the risk. Ed Davey's the person who could be inclined to go back into another Conservative coalition because he's got form. Leila Moran hasn't. So if there's a lift, it would help either of those two as leader, but it would help Leila Moran more. Remember, the people that the Lib Dems need back the most are the disillusioned left-wing voters. Ed Davey doesn't offer them much. Leila Moran does, and he's a libertarian. That's a bit of a wild card in British politics, but it's a wild card I'd be willing to play when you've got little more than a busted flush in your hand.
Well, you've been a wild card yourself a number of times. Lembit, Opik, thank you for appearing once again on the Alex Salmond Show.
Always my pleasure.
The Liberal Democrat leadership contest has taken place against the backcloth of a global pandemic. Of necessity, it has been a virtual contest. However, Sir Vince Cable is refreshingly frank when he says that even in different circumstances, it had been difficult to sustain much excitement. After all, the Liberals have been through 3 bruising general election contests in quick succession, the last of which they did much themselves to provoke. However, politics is always changing. The great Liberal revival has been forecast many times since Lloyd George left office a century ago. But rather like the Holy Grail, it's been difficult to find and even more difficult to retain. Equally, the equivalent and opposite suggestions of the party's imminent demise have also been greatly exaggerated. There have been ups and downs, but they're not dead yet. And in politics, where there's any life at all, there's always hope. And so from Tasmina, myself and all at the show, it's goodbye for now. Stay safe. We'll see you again next week.